So we're going to build on the diagram that we used in the first two modules to understand Immanuel Kant's transcendental method and extend it into a diagram that shows us what Fichte was up to in his attempt to radicalize the Kantian method. So you'll remember for Kant we've got the mind, the phenomenal realm of space and time, and whereas for Kant we had these categories of understanding that provide the conditions for the possibility of our cognition of objects in space and time, for Fichte those categories of understanding cannot simply be assumed or given. He wants to understand everything as a generative process stemming from an original act, right? The free act of the absolute I or absolute ego. So whereas for Kant we had the crucifix depicting the moral law within, for Fichte God is, for all intents and purposes, replaced by the I, the absolute I, not the empirical I, not our finite personalities, that which separates me from you, but the absolute I, right? That which we all participate in as free, rational members of an ethical community. So for Fichte, the I is where it all begins. And this noumenal realm that for Kant was beyond our ability to know anything about other than that it exists, this is no more. And in its place are other minds. For Fichte, what checks the freedom of my own mind and allows me to know that there is something outside of myself are other selves, right? So the I begins to become conscious of itself because of the summons from the not I, from those other than myself. So there's a way in which we are intersubjectively bound up with the finite being of other minds, and through relationships of what Fichte calls mutual recognition, we help to perfect one another's consciousness. So through a sort of mirror imaging here, I become conscious of myself, self-conscious of myself, by positing myself as an object. And this object, this objectification of myself, is not really satisfying. It's not what I was originally seeking in attempting to become self-conscious. I was seeking a subject. So this attempt to know myself brings me into relationship with an objectified version of myself, which then starts this sort of paradoxical, recursive, and generative process where the freedom of the absolute I begins to posit its own limits, right? The first limit is, of course, other selves who we know are just like us. But then there is a whole other set of limits. The categories of the understanding are generated by the absolute I to limit its own cognition. The phenomenal realm of space and time, which we could depict in here, is also generated by the absolute ego as a form of necessity to limit its freedom, which allows, again, for self-consciousness. But there's a way in which, again, my confrontation with others, with other minds, helps to raise my own consciousness to a higher intensity, a higher degree of awareness. So there's a way in which others sort of play a constitutive role in the formation of our own minds, right? So there's a way in which we are penetrated in and participated in by the presence of other minds, right? So we're not in a solipsistic shell. We're actually bound up with one another, and the perfection of our own finite self occurs in the social self, right? So for Fichte, the goal is to realize this higher form of identity beyond our individuality in a social self, which is this perfected ethical community where free beings limit their own freedom in order to provide for the freedom of others. Now, what happens to the phenomenal realm of nature in all of this? Well, nature is this sort of intersubjective space between free agents in a moral community. And for Fichte, the idea is to, we experience nature as a sort of stage upon which our freedom is realized. And gradually, it's our duty to remake nature in our own image, so that eventually there is no more resistance provided by something outside of ourselves that might limit our freedom, and instead the entirety of nature becomes merely a stage that facilitates our own free activity, right? So the goal for nature, for Fichte, is to eliminate or annihilate nature, so that all that remains is this sort of human moral community, right, where we do what humans do if we had complete freedom in this perfected community. So hopefully that helps you make sense of what is admittedly a difficult argument that Fichte tries to lead us through. And I'm going to try to continue this diagram as we move into Goethe and Schelling as well. So yeah, hope that's helpful.